Hello FlossTube and welcome to the third part of the Celebration of Colour Stitch Along 2024. I'm Roz, this is Roz Clark Craft here on YouTube. You can also find me over on Instagram and on Etsy. So, I think I have to start with an apology. I'm really sorry if you're stitching along and you got to part 2 and you're like, this doesn't seem to completely line up with what we did in part 1. Do you know, it's been so much harder than I was expecting to split this up into parts and to get consistency from one part to the next. And I'm really sorry that in part 2 there were some mistakes with that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my part 2 on the one that I'm doing as the stitch along, not the model stitch. And the download from the link tree has been updated, but obviously if you didn't know it was updated, you might not have done that. I know some people are doing the stitch along but aren't on Instagram, which is where I've been trying to post the updates to get everything right. So let me just show you in case you haven't worked this out for yourself. So down here, there's a little bit there. Now, what you should have on that last little section, there's 5 yellow stitches and then directly going into the 2 red stitches. I think on an earlier version of this, and possibly, I can't remember whether in the part 1 version or in the part 2 version, I only had you do 4 of those yellow stitches. But anyway, you should have done 5 and then the 2 red stitches join onto it precisely. If you haven't done the yellow stitch yet, that's fine. Because you'll be doing some more yellow in that area. You can go and fill that in at any point. But you just want to make sure that your red stitches, there's 5 spaces for those yellow stitches there before you add them in. Up here, so this is where you stitched the yellow up to on part 1. And you did your red purple 2 stitches just below that. You should have 2 stitches of red just below that. I think it's, for some reason I had it up here, but it should be down here. So you've got 2 red purple and then 2 red underneath that. My red and red purple don't look very different on the screen, I'm sorry, but anyway, you haven't added any to this yellow line in the middle, so you can see they both come below where that is. And I feel like there was one other thing that I just noticed. Oh, yes. Now, this was entirely, yeah, I should have got this right. So your 2 black rectangles that you've done in part 2, they should be identical. I had failed to remember to put that gap in that top line of the second rectangle. So on the first one, you can see where the gap is because the red rectangle goes through it. On the bottom one, you're going to also want a little gap there, 2 stitches in. If you've stitched that, which I had, the way I deal with that, I just cut it out. And yes, you've got very tiny ends on the back. If you're worried that they're going to come undone while you're still stitching, you could put a little blob of glue to hold that in place. But also when you've finished, if you back your stitching with interfacing, that'll hold them in place as well. I mean, it slightly depends how you're going to finish this. If it's going to be like, I don't know, on some kind of pouch that's going to be in your bag and get a lot of rough and tumble, then maybe. But if you're going to, I don't know, frame it or journal it or whatever, that'll be fine. Just to hold it in place with a little bit of glue, a little bit of interfacing. I mean, if you want to restitch the whole thing, I'm not going to stop you. But I'm also going to say you don't need to. And the other thing you could do as well is you could leave it there and know that you're going to change it when you stitch through. So you will stitch that square. And so at that point, you could make sure with the working thread you've got at that time that you catch those ends in. If you unstitch it just before you restitch it in the right colour, then you know where those ends are and you can hold them in straight away. So I'm really sorry about that. I have been triple checking part 3. So I haven't yet stitched part 3, but I'm filming this video like a week before it's going to come out, so I will have stitched it by the time this comes out and part 3 is released, and hopefully then I will have been able to spot any errors in the chart and correct them before it's published. If you're stitching and you think, I mean, I know it's not always immediately obvious on this, but if you think, I'm not sure that is right, or particularly if you think, where she's got the grey, you know, which is what I'm doing just to show you where your stitching should already exist, and you think, well, that's not where my stitching is, do feel free to get in touch and just check, because I'm very, very aware that there may be mistakes in it, and I really don't want there to be, because it's not something that's easy to fudge. If there are mistakes, they do need correcting, and I don't want you to have to do that. So you can always leave a comment on any of my YouTube videos and I'll see that. Or if you're on Instagram, you can message me there and I will try and respond straight away. It's not that easy to respond to those things. So if you leave a comment on YouTube, I can reply to your comment. But it's not that easy to do sort of announcements about these things on YouTube without doing a whole other video. I mean, there is supposed to be a way to do it, but I don't really know how, and I also don't know how effective it is. So yeah, and just to say, the other thing you can do, if somebody else has brought that to my attention or I've noticed it and edited the chart, you can always check back at the link where you download the chart and download it again and see if there have been changes. And I will put a little note, corrected on, whatever day I've corrected it on the chart itself, so you can check whether you've actually got the most up-to-date and hopefully therefore the most correct version. Anyway, so we are on to Redorange, and I'm going to put a photo here that I took while I was doing the initial model stitch of what that's going to look like. Definitely don't try and stitch or check your stitching on the basis of these photos, because I took the photos obviously as I went through part by part, but I did make changes to the design also as I was going through, which I did not then go back and undo whole stages so I could take a photo of the corrected. I still got this really awful cough. It's been hanging around for not quite 3 weeks now, and it's not great. Anyway, so that is Redorange. One thing that I sort of hope you will increasingly do as we introduce more colour. Oh, I have one other thing to remind myself to say, but that I hope you'll do as we introduce more colours, is just to think about what effect those colours have on the overall feel of the stitching. So because it's not, I think I can give this away now. It's not a picture. It's not a figurative depiction of a thing. Your mind hopefully isn't distracted by that and isn't just thinking, oh yeah, but you know, that's just the this or the whatever. So, you know, does the addition of that new colour make it richer or brighter or fresher or, I don't know, more mysterious, or I don't know, and it will be different because obviously you've all chosen a different colour palette to work with, but have a look at how the colours interact with each other. When you put the red orange next to the red purple, does that change how the way they look? What about with the red? What about with them separately? And, you know, this will be increasingly the case as we start moving through, you know, to orange and then yellow, and we'll introduce green and blue, and finally we'll complete the whole thing round at purple. I think it's really fascinating. It's one of the things I really enjoyed as I was stitching through the model part by part, was how the whole thing sort of changed when I added in each colour. And you can get that sort of sense with any design if you do a colour completion way of stitching. You know, you stitch each colour at a time, and if you are deliberate in how you choose which colours you're sort of completing together, you could really get a similar effect. And, you know, if you've done all your blues on a design and then you move on to your greens, or then you add in pink, or then you add in the reds, and just how that changes the feel of the picture as you move through the colour wheel. So do start to look out for that now that we're adding a few more colours. The thing I needed to remember to say, this is not a mistake, but just to let you know, both the red and the red purple, there are a few more stitches to come of both of those in the frame. So you can see already, hopefully, how those, you know, they have their sort of own sections, you know, these sort of bits here and down here, but they also appear in the frame with the yellow around them. Looks mine does not look like that. It's yeah, lighting at this time of year I find really hard. Anyway, you know, you've got these red and red purple bits here. There are a few more of those because obviously the frame is not finished yet. And so we haven't stitched all of those little bits. From now on, almost until we get to the end, however, you will be colour completing. So as we do red orange, we will do literally every red orange stitch in the design. We will also be doing a little bit of frame in that. We'll certainly be doing some black. I think there's some yellow as well. I think there's some yellow in all of them until we get to yellow in the colour wheel, and then we're going to finish all of the yellow in one go, which is very pleasing. So yeah, if you're thinking, oh, I can put these threads away, just hold on to your red and your red purple because you will need those again. And obviously we're not finished yet with the yellow or the black, but we will be finished with the red orange. So that's exciting. Right, I don't think I have anything else to say about the stitching at this point. It's really lovely seeing people making progress with theirs and putting those on Instagram. What I might do at some point, maybe like when we're halfway through, I might say to people, are you happy for me to include some of those photos in one of my videos as well? Because I know not everyone on Instagram, and it is really interesting to see, well, it's interesting to me anyway, how the different colour palettes are coming together. Somebody posted their beginning of part 1 yesterday, and she's got much paler, softer colours, and she was like, what does it look like so far? It's kind of a cherry banana circuit board, which I thought was brilliant. But I think it'll be really interesting. Maybe halfway through we'll do that and sort of see the different ways that it's coming out for people on that. So I did want to talk a bit more in this video about colour perception. On the previous video, yeah, I think that's right, on the previous Celebration of Colour video, Rachel from Stitchy Rach left a really great comment about a thing which I have thought about for years and years and years, which is, how do I know whether what I see when I'm looking at something and I say, well, that's red, how do I know whether that is the same as what you see when you look at that same thing and say, well, that's red? How do I know that my red is the same as your red? Is it the same as your red? So I think it's a really great question that really gets to the heart of what is colour and what do we see and perceive as colour. So one thing we can say is, well, we all generally agree, you know, there is some fuzziness around the edge, but we all can generally agree when we look at a set of things, yeah, those are the red things, those are the blue things, those are the green things. And like I say, you might have a colour that's, you know, very red purplish, and you're like, well, I think that's more like red and you think that's more like blue, but you know, we can all agree it's somewhere in between, really. So we know that there's something we can kind of identify as red. And speaking with my very old, dusty, falling apart physics hat on, that is representing a spectrum of light. So light is a very complicated phenomenon, but one way we can understand it is as a wave. Okay, that's the, you know, international hand signal for wave. It is a wave, and waves have height, they can be really high, and they can be really long, that's wavelength, and they can come really often, and that's frequency. Yeah, I mean, that's a really bad explanation of waves. Anyway, you don't really need to know that. What you need to know is that the kind of waves that make up light, and indeed a whole lot of other things, X-rays and radio waves and all sorts of things, are all the same kind of wave, but they have different wavelengths and different frequencies. Here's where you're going to learn something really, you know, show-offy. That's basically what Einstein is saying. He's saying the speed of light is always the same. That's c in E equals mc squared. C is the speed of light, and it's always the same. But what does change is the wavelength and the frequency. So some is very long, slow waves, and some is very quick waves. And the colour that we see, whether we can see it at all as light, and the particular colour we see of that light depends on the wavelength of the frequency of that light. If the wavelength gets too short, we can't see it. The wavelength gets too long, we can't see it. And that's why I think this is true. There are certain animals that can see a different spectrum of light from us. They can see things sort of beyond the edge of red that we can't see, or beyond the edge of purple that we can't see. And sort of if you go off beyond the edge of red, that's what we call infrared. And if you go off beyond the end of purple, that's what we call ultraviolet. And it's not that those things don't exist as light, it's that our perception of that is limited to a particular range. And so when we say that's red, I can see red, what we're really saying is that is what I perceive when I see something with that particular wavelength of light. Almost always we're seeing a mixture, but let's, you know, we don't need to get too complicated about that. There's a sort of physical reality to what that light is that corresponds to what we call red. And if that wavelength changes, then we start to call it orange or yellow or green or whatever. Or we start to say, actually, I can't see that. And that, you know, that's a physical, measurable quantity, kind of measurable. Yeah, anyway, we're not going to talk about physics anymore, but we are going to talk about something I know even less about, which is biology. What we have in our eyes by way of receptors determines how much we are able to distinguish along that set of wavelengths that we can see. So I came across this on Facebook just this week, actually, and I thought, oh, that's exactly what I want to talk about. So I'm going to put this image here. And the test is how many different colours can you see? Now, it comes with an awful lot of caveats about, is your screen and is my screen capable of displaying the level of distinguishing colours that it needs to be able to do? And is what I have copied from, you know, my screen and then pasted on here really the actual image, and so on. So huge caveat, this is not an official test of anything, but it will give you a general idea of how you might test this. So if you want to pause it and count colours, I'll also put a link below if you want to find a better image that you can download and look at in your own time. But, and don't presume that colours are all the same width. They are deliberately not. So if you just count every one of the thinnest gaps and say, oh yeah, they're probably all different colours, you will end up saying that there are more colours there than there actually are. So you do have to count the ones you think you can properly distinguish. Now, if you count 20 or fewer, then that is an indicator that you have 2 receptors and would come within the official sort of diagnosis of colorblind. So you can still see some colors. You could, you know, if you've got 20 colors, that's not nothing, but there will be some colors that you are just not able to distinguish. And that might be, we've mentioned before, red-green colorblindness, very common sort of colorblindness in men, but it could just be a sort of general inability to really distinguish between shades of colour. If you've got up to 30 colours, then you have 3 receptors, and that's a very normal level of colour perception. And if you have more than 30 colours, I think there are 39 altogether in the thing, but if you have more than 30, then that's an indication that you have 4 receptors, and you can class yourself as a super seer or something like that. And I mean, it's not super unusual. I think it's maybe up to 30% of the population have 4 receptors, and you can see, you know, potentially twice as many colours as people in the first category. So what does that mean? Well, I think it explains quite a lot about why you might show your partner a paint shade chart and say, well, what do you think, this one, this one, this one? And they're like, well, they all look the same. It's not that they don't care. I mean, it could be. I'm not saying necessarily that they do, but it could be that they genuinely just can't see the distinction, that sort of narrow distinction in colour that you can, especially if you're a super seer. So don't just assume that somebody's being lazy or, you know, uninterested. It could genuinely be that they cannot see the same distinction in colour that you can. Or the other way around. They might be like, oh, those just don't really go at all. And you're like, they look exactly the same to me. So we know we have at some level different perceptions of colour, that some people cannot distinguish as many colours as others. Now, that doesn't quite answer the question of how do I know that red is red for all of us. And I don't think, philosophically, I'm not sure we ever can answer that question, because what we are then talking about is not just the information that comes into your eye, that's the wavelength of the light, and not just the sort of physical receptors in your eye which distinguish that as much as they can. It's then a question of what does your brain do with it? And I don't know a way of downloading what's happening in my brain to compare with what's happening in your brain. All I can say is that we have the same incoming data and the same, or, you know, at least overlapping amounts of, you know, different amounts of, but fundamentally the same biological structure to perceive that, but then we have different brains, and I don't know if we can talk about what happens in our brains with any great confidence. I certainly can't. That's my limit. When we think about perceiving color, we're not just talking about the physical reality out there. We're talking about what our eyes and our brains do with that, and our brains do a lot more work than we realize. They do a lot of subconscious work around colour. And that brings us to the dress. You all remember the dress. Why is it that people genuinely could see such entirely different things when they looked at the same photograph? Surely they're getting the same light information, absolutely, being processed similarly by their receptors, whatever kind of receptors, however much they've got of that. Why then were people's brains processing it so entirely differently? And we know that they were processing it differently in this case because they weren't even using the same words for it. You weren't getting it into your brain and saying, oh, well, I think that must be blue. It's like, well, that is blue. And somebody else was like, well, that is white. That is gold. No, that's black. And so clearly there was something in our brains that was changing, even though we were getting the same information being processed through eyes that work in the same kind of way. And why was that? Well, it's because of the work our brains do. And brains complicated. I don't pretend to understand brains. But one thing that they do when they're identifying colour is they look at context. And one of the things with the photo of the dress was it was sort of stripped of context that would have helped our brains process it. So if, for example, you'd had a person in the photograph with skin colour, then your brain would have been able to say, right, I need to process the skin colour within this sort of range. And, you know, obviously skin colour varies, but it's all within that sort of peachy, yellowy, browny kind of thing. It's not green or blue. And so your brain's saying, right, well, that's got to be somewhere within that kind of family of skin tones. So therefore, what's next to it must be this colour or this colour. And we're going to do the same, whatever processing I need to do to the skin colour, I'm going to do that to the dress. And then we're going to produce a coherent image. But because there wasn't any of that context, your brain didn't quite know what to do with that. And I think there is some evidence that people with 4 receptors tended to see blue-black, maybe. I can't remember. It tended to see it one way anyway. And people with 3 receptors or 2 receptors tended to see it the other way. I don't think it was, you know, absolutely dead cert, but there was certainly something about that going on as well. So, yeah, really fascinating study to do with how our eyes and our brains work to perceive colour. So that's what I wanted to just briefly talk to you a little bit about today, is this book, Joseph Alber's Interaction of Colour. So this came out, I mean, a long time ago. My copy is quite new, but this is not a new book. It's 1963. And Joseph Albers was doing study in colour and colour theory. And one of the things that he was very interested in was this idea that the way we process colours in our minds depends on the context we see those colours in. And it's sort of the origin of a lot of those things that you'll see all over the internet on, you know, are these colours different or the same, lighter or darker? So he would make these out of actual paper. And so in this one, the question would be this colour here in the little square and this colour here, which is lighter, which is darker? So, I mean, I think pretty obviously this one looks much darker than that one. But he would make it, and this would be one strip of paper that he'd pull out, and he'd be like, that's one colour. So you could see, what is it that makes this colour look lighter and this colour look darker? Well, it is the context, isn't it? The context in the blues or the context in the yellows and the oranges. And I'm sure we've all seen that sort of thing before. As another example, the green grid. I think it's so interesting because here, to me, it's not so much that it's a different colour, but it's yeah, it's just the way that it looks. It stands out so much on this yellow background, and it sort of fades in. It's almost like it's grayer, I think, here, and greener here. There we go. Where's the next one I want to show you? Oh yeah, so this is the one that's actually from the cover of the book. And the question here is, which is the bluest blue and which is the reddest red? So have a look at the blues first. Which is the bluest blue? I mean, you may not be able to see this perfectly, but in the picture in the book, it's definitely this one. You know, the rest are all a little bit, yeah, my lighting is awful, a little bit grayer, a little bit more muted, but that one is very vivid. With the reds, I wonder which one you would say. I'm going to show you the front of the book because you can see the same image, but maybe a bit bigger and a bit more easily. Which of those would you say is the reddest red? I think maybe this one. But it's interesting. He says, for the reds, disagreement will be expected. Both reds at the top. I think that's right. No, both reds at the bottom. There we go. Those two. That one's pretty red. May get votes of first choice. First one probably from older and second one from younger voters. Interesting. This one or this one? Younger, older. Writing this in 1963, so, you know, don't get too caught up on whether you're younger or older. The second one, a vermilion or orange red, has become fashionable with designers, especially typographers, in black and red advertising. And I think that's true. I think I would never have said that one was the reddest red. This one, or maybe this one, I would say. You know, that sort of much brighter scarlet, vivid red or orange red. Good. Now, here's a thing. We've all seen those, I think, haven't we? Where it's kind of trying to make, where what the effect makes the same colour look different in two places. I wonder what you think about this one. So those two little squares in the middle, the tan and the tan, which one looks darker, which one looks lighter? They look quite similar, don't they? But actually, one of them is that and one of them is that. So you can also use context to make colours look the same, which are fundamentally really quite different. I thought that was really fascinating. I don't think I've seen that one much before. Now here's a thing that he does on colour interaction that will be of great interest to anyone who's stitched a cross-stitch house. If you choose to use the same colour thread but on different linen, it can have a huge impact. And this is a thing called the Bezold effect. So just have a look at those. That is the same red on a white background on a black background. I don't know how well that's coming across, but to me here, it's not just that the overall thing obviously looks lighter with the white background. The red itself looks whiter. So yes, one of my colour students showed in plate, whatever, light red bricks laid out with a very white mortar and the same bricks laid out with a pure black mortar. The red with the the red with the white looks much lighter than the red with the black, particularly at a distance. There we go. If I hold it there, hopefully you can see that. Your background makes a difference to how you see the colour. So it's just really fascinating, I think. All those things that were like, oh, wow, you know, on Facebook or wherever you get your memes, there is actual science around that. And he talks a lot about what are the effects. I think it is still a thing that we can't honestly say we really understand. But he has a number of different effects that we can observe about how colours interact. And next time, what are we moving on to next? Oh, next time we're moving on to orange. I'm going to talk about something completely different. But maybe when we move on to orange yellow, I think we're then going to go back and talk about one of my very, very favourite artists who exploits colour interaction like no one I know. It's quite phenomenal. And I think there are things we could learn from her. So I'm going to put below in the links a link to the image where you can test to give yourself an idea of whether you've got 2, 3 or 4 colour receptors. And I'm also going to include a link to a little app that I really enjoyed a few years ago. You may have come across it and done it, but I think it's really interesting. It's called Hue, H-U-E, Hue. I don't know whether you can get it for both Apple and Android. I think I've done it on Android. I don't know whether you can get it for Apple. There was probably something similar. But it's just about, you know, you start with sort of lines and then you move into 2-dimensional grids, placing colours in order. So you might have green at one end and a purple at the other, and a spectrum of colours between that's a perfect gradient, and you have to put the colour blocks to make that perfect gradient. And it's a really fascinating thing because you can see, you may not think you can see very clearly the distinction between each of those little colours, but when they're in the wrong place, you really, really can. And something that you think, oh, that's basically green, can suddenly look purple if you've got it in the wrong place in that spectrum. So it's a fun way, really fun way, and quite soothing. And, you know, I really like it. Of just getting a sense of how this colour interaction and colour context affects the perception that we have of colour. Good, so I hope you enjoy stitching part 3. I really hope there aren't any mistakes in it, but please let me know if you are not sure or if you think you found a mistake. And we'll be back. I'm trying to remember. I think we might be back in a week. I need to check the schedule. I'll put it in the description below when the next part is due coming out, because I think this is the last of the sort of bigger, I mean, they're not huge anyway, but you know, the bigger parts, and we're getting into sort of smaller ones